Hello, and welcome to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. This is the first in a series of conversations called Democracy Matters, Conversations on the Future of the Free World. And in this first conversation, I, Mariam Memarsadeghi, Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, am very pleased and honored to have as my guest Alireza Nader, who is a dear friend and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Alireza Nader has for many years focused on Iran, and I thought I would begin by asking you, Alireza John, to describe a bit about how you decided to make Iran and the struggle for democracy in Iran and the struggle for a more peaceful Middle East region that would result from a democratic Iran, the focus of your career.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mariam. And thank you very much to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for doing this event. You've been putting out a lot of great work on Iran, and I really do appreciate it. I think Canadian Iranians will particularly appreciate it as they struggle to free their homeland and seek justice, especially for the Islamic Republic's shoot down of the Ukrainian flight PS752. But to answer your question, why did I choose to work on Iran? Well, and I think we've talked about this, Mariam, and this is one of the reasons we're friends. I think our experiences are very similar, as are the experiences of millions and millions of Iranians who have lost their home and have been really struggling to get back to Iran and free it from the dictatorship under Ayatollah Khamenei. I just really care about Iran. I think fundamentally, my personal goal is to go back to Iran. I have not been there since the age of 10. And one of the reasons, the selfish reason I fight for democracy in Iran and for a free Iran, because I want to go back and see Iran. I think it's a wonderful country with a very rich history. And its people are fighting a brutal dictatorship. And as you know very well, their voices are not reaching the outside world. The Islamic Republic has tried very hard to keep information from coming out of Iran. We're approaching the anniversary of the 2019 Aban uprising, during which the Islamic Republic massacred thousands of Iranians, according to Reuters, 1,500 Iranian protesters, although I believe the number could be much higher. So I think it's really important for Iranian Americans like us, Iranians like us, to really help understand policymakers and the wider public in places like Canada and the United States and really everywhere, to really inform stakeholders and policymakers about what's really happening in Iran, because it's a very important country and we don't really fully get the necessary information to figure out what's happening.
Yeah, in a recent post that, in a recent op-ed that you wrote on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute website, and in other writings that you've had in prominent publications, you've chosen to focus on Canada and Canadian foreign policy towards the Islamic Republic. In particular, you've been very critical of Justin Trudeau's not just stance towards the Islamic Republic, but in general, his worldview and his posture towards repressive regimes, including China. Can you describe first why you see Trudeau's stance on the Islamic Republic and other repressive regimes as harmful to Canadian interests?
Well, I think when we look at regimes like the Islamic Republic and Communist China, there are a direct threat to the national security of countries like Canada and the United States. They are a threat to our democracies, our way of life, but also in the case of the Islamic Republic and Iran, it has a very significant network of regime agents, money launderers, and political influencers that are shaping Canadian policy toward Iran. And the Prime Minister has promised the families of the PS 752 criminal act that they would receive justice, that he would seek answers from them, from the Islamic Republic. But he has really done no such thing. He's made a lot of promises, but he hasn't delivered on them. He hasn't targeted the regimes that work in Canada. He has not designated the Revolutionary Guards in Iran as a terrorist organization. And without having these sort of pressures, Canada has no leverage over the regime in Iran. And I think it's important for Trudeau to deliver on his promise.
What would it achieve to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist entity? What would Canada gain by doing that?
Well, first and foremost, it would send a very clear message to the regime in Iran that Canada is serious about seeking answers to PS 752. The regime has not provided any transparency about this criminal act. Nobody has been held to account, and Canada and the international community have to do much more. By designating the Revolutionary Guards also, it allows Canadian law enforcement, like CSIS, to really go after the regime's assets and people in Canada. I've done some field work in Canada. I've had many activists tell me that they are afraid that they're going to be targeted in Canada, and the Canadian government hasn't done very much. And I think that's really unacceptable for a democracy like Canada to accept this sort of behavior, to allow the regime to launder billions of money into Canada and pretend that just pure engagement and diplomacy and a soft approach to the Islamic Republic will protect Canadian national security and provide justice to the families of PS 752.
What is it that you think Trudeau and people who agree with Trudeau don't understand about these regimes? There is a naivete that you seem to point to in that way of thinking. What is it that they don't understand that they should?
Well, Trudeau has in the past expressed admiration for authoritarian regimes. He praised Fidel Castro, despite that brutal regime's record of human rights abuses in Cuba. And for a progressive like Trudeau, who states that he cares about these issues, for example, gay rights. If he really does care about gay rights and thinks gay rights are a universal issue, then that should apply to Iran as well. Not only has Trudeau praised authoritarian regimes, he has blamed the United States for the conflict between Iran and the US. And I think it's a very simplistic interpretation. When PS 752 was shot down, he said it was due to regional tensions, and that is just not accurate. That was an intentional act by the regime to shoot that plane, and the US bears no responsibility for that.
Yeah, and even going back much further in history, Zahra Kazemi, a Canadian Iranian photographer, was tortured and killed in custody by the regime. Can you say a bit about that and how that should have altered foreign policy from the Canadian government more than it did?
Yes, her death in an Iranian jail was just gruesome. She was tortured and beaten. And I think, that Canada and the United States failure to punish the regime for abusing and killing and taking hostage Canadian Iranians and Iranian Americans really, I think, that set up a pattern starting at that time for the regime to get away with this sort of activity. And foreign governments, especially democracies, have to make sure their citizens are protected and there are consequences for their citizens being killed. The Canadian government traditionally, especially under Trudeau, has really prioritized investments and trade with Iran more than anything. And I really do believe that ultimately Trudeau's not just motivated by the Biden administration's policies toward Iran, but he's really waiting for sanctions to be lifted so Canadian companies can go and do business in Iran. And I think that's one of the issues or critiques I and a lot of other people have of the Trudeau government, that they prioritize making money with really an evil regime like that of Iran, and you can arguably say communist China, while paying lip service to universal human rights. So that makes really everybody cynical.
Right. Isn't that ironic that the politicians in the West who have the progressive worldview, as you mentioned, gay rights, women's rights, labor rights, respect for minority rights, and the persecution of people based on their identity. It is those very politicians, political groups, campus groups who are much more tolerant, if not even respectful, towards the Communist Party in China, towards the Islamic Republic. I wonder if we can just talk a little bit about historically why you think that's come to happen in democracies, and how does it threaten the democracies themselves in the free world, in the West and other parts of the world that are already democratic? How does that so-called progressive worldview threaten democracy at home?
The people who have shaped and defined progressive foreign policy in America, I believe, have this tendency, especially in the case of Iran, to believe that everything is America's fault or the West's fault. And of course, the United States and European countries and Canada are to blame for some things. They made mistakes in Iran and the Middle East as well. But I think that progressives in general, especially Canadian or American progressives, really don't see that the regime in Iran has agency, that not everything it does is a reaction to what the United States does. Like, for example, there's a very prominent journalist in the United States who blamed President Trump for the November 2019 massacre in Iran. And whatever you think of Trump, the reality is that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and Rouhani, who was president at that time, gave the orders to the regime security forces to kill innocent people en masse. And a lot of progressives just don't really care about that. They say they care about human rights and gay rights and women's rights and environmental issues. But when it comes to authoritarian regimes in Iran, they're very tolerant of those regimes' abuse of their own people. And I think that really shapes foreign policy, because when you look at American academia, for example, there's a lot of apologism toward the Islamic Republic.
You mentioned the Aban massacre. Aban is the current month on the Iranian calendar, and we are at the 2-year anniversary of the massacre of peaceful protesters in over 100, perhaps over 200 cities and towns throughout the country. The Aban uprising was a part of a series of protests that really galvanized the entire country against the regime, with slogans that were unmistakably for peaceful overthrow and transition to democracy. Among the most popular slogans were those that targeted both the reformists and the hardliners, showing that the protesters believe there's not only no difference between the two, but that there is much more palpable anger even towards the reformists than the hardliners, because of the promises unfulfilled that the reformists have been giving for over 2 decades now. Can you tell us more about the aspirations of the Iranian people now? What is the mood on the street? What is the mood on social media? How are people shaping the discourse around this aspiration for peaceful overthrow?
And thank you for that great explanation of the Aban uprising. The Iranians want this regime gone. There's no doubt about that. And I do really believe that the vast majority of Iranians, based on anecdotal evidence, but also surveys and just studying Iran, want a secular country. They don't want Islamist rule. And they've made that very clear in the past few years. In addition to Aban, there have been several other major demonstrations and uprisings, and they seem to be happening periodically in Iran because this is basically an evil regime. There's really no other way to describe it. It has exploited the Iranian people, Iran's natural resources, and the entire, the Middle East for the last 43 years. Ayatollah Khomeini was famous for saying, when he was asked on the plane coming back to Iran from exile, a reporter asked him, how do you feel about returning to Iran? And he said, I feel nothing. And essentially, I think that describes the Islamic Republic. You have Islamist rulers who don't really care about Iran as a nation, but see it as a cause for a worldwide Islamic revolution. And that feeling is very much alive among the ruling class in Iran. But the people of Iran don't want that. They've been protesting against the regime's policies in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere. And I think, like all people, the people of Iran want to have a peaceful and prosperous life. With this regime, it is extremely brutal, as has been demonstrated in the last 43 years, but really by the Aban massacre. I think if people were not afraid, you would see mass demonstrations in Iran. You would see pressure for a peaceful transition to democracy. But this regime is just extremely brutal, will kill anybody it sees as a threat, and doesn't expect any sort of international pressure and response, especially from countries like Canada.
And this regime, in fact, is responsible for Soleimani in particular, responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of peaceful it started out as a peaceful movement for just reform, not even overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, and resulted in very quickly the shooting of peaceful protesters from helicopter gunships. And that war that Assad waged on the Syrian people was very much fueled by the regime that we're talking about. Alireza John, you have been following Iran for a long time. Can you draw some comparisons, contrasts to how Iranians were thinking and talking about political change in 2009 during the Green Movement and how they are now? The Green Movement, as a reminder for folks, was a time when millions of people were on the streets of Tehran and some other cities. Millions is a huge number, and at the time, the election was called for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and some people had chosen to vote in that election supporting Mousavi and Karoubi. But the movement on the streets, the people on the streets were all kinds of Iranians. Some had chosen to vote and were clearly supporters of Mousavi and Karoubi. Some hadn't voted at all. Some hadn't voted in any of the regime's elections. But the slogans very quickly became against the entirety of the regime, for wholesale overthrow, death to the dictator. Can you, and one of the slogans that continues to be very popular, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life for Iran, meaning no, we don't support the regime's funneling of funds and support to Hamas and others in Gaza, or in Lebanon, Hezbollah, but rather we support our Iranian nation, and we don't want the regime to be backing these killers. That slogan has continued and been very consistent over the last 10 years. But can you describe, in your own view, having closely monitored the civic discourse, the political demands, how things have evolved, both for the better and the worse, if there is the worse also?
The most important development in the last 10 years plus, since 2009 especially, has been the breaking of this myth, both in Iran and the United States and the West, that the Islamic Republic can be reformed, that it can moderate. This is an absolute theocracy ruled by a dictator who believes he has a mandate from God, and he's backed by a vast security and military force. That's the reality of Iran. Iranians have realized since 2009 especially that this regime is not going to be reformed, that the reformists and so-called moderates like Rouhani are very much a fabric of this regime. They're the foundations of this regime, that there are no moderates in this regime, and that really the only way Iran can be saved. And Iran is a dying country. If you look at its environmental condition and water shortages, it is dying and it has to be saved. But the only way to save Iran is to get rid of this regime. And because it is a heavily armed regime, peaceful protests, labor strikes, teacher strikes, you name it, have been the primary method that the people of Iran have been fighting this regime. Yeah. But without international support, I think it would be very hard to really see a transition to democracy in Iran.
Can you say more about that? What international support do you think is required?
The main problem with democratization in Iran is the nuclear issue. The West has really prioritized the nuclear issue at the expense of everything else happening in Iran, and I would argue a lot of things happening in the Middle East. So as long as Washington and Ottawa are willing to ignore the crimes against humanity in Iran for the sake of achieving a nuclear agreement or going back into the nuclear agreement that is on its deathbed, I think it will be very difficult to see democracy come to Iran. I think once the nuclear issue, and who knows if it'll ever be resolved, but as long as the nuclear issue, I think, is a priority, the people of Iran are trapped in this massive prison run by the Islamic Republic. I think even moral support is important. For example, in 2009, as you mentioned, Iranians were crying out for President Obama to come to their aid. In Persian, they were saying, "Is he with us or with them?" And really, Obama threw them under the bus because of the nuclear agreement. Surprisingly, actually, Ben Rhodes, someone who's really responsible for that policy, said he regrets it and he thinks Obama regrets it. But of course, I think the United States and the West missed a crucial chance in 2009 and since then to come to the help of the Iranian people, because as long as this regime is in power, I don't think the nuclear issue is going to be resolved. The threat of conflict in the Middle East will not go away. The regime is the main problem in Iran, not just the nuclear program.
Yeah, the Biden and Trudeau policies towards Iran right now are a repeat of the Obama posture. So I'm not sure how much I can believe the regrets that Obama, Hillary, Ben Rhodes, others have expressed. But so you mentioned—
I don't believe in them too, but politicians say things to make themselves look good. He was doing that interview with Masih Alinejad, and she put him on the spot.
At least there's lip service now to the idea that it was wrong to abandon protesters when they were out on the streets and when it was clear that their aspiration was for democracy. So you've mentioned the listing of the IRGC, you've mentioned moral support, you've mentioned people in Iran who strike from various sectors. One demand has been to support the strikers more through a labor strike fund. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where you're a senior fellow, has called for other policy changes to support the people. If you want, maybe talk a bit about that, and then we can move to one last question.
The policy, I think, that will be more effective than anything is maximum support for the Iranian people. And by that, I mean not just imposing sanctions on Iran and expecting these issues to go away, but supporting the Iranian people's aspirations for democracy. And the US and Canada can do a lot in this manner by supporting democratization programs and civil society programs in Iran. But that has really been on the wane. And, until that support is coming, I think the people of Iran, what I sense, there's a general psychology that as long as the West or the rest of the world supports this regime, nothing will change in Iran. And so why should they rise up and be massacred in the streets while the Biden and Trudeau administration are waiting to do business with Iran? But in terms of, you asked about, for example, labor strikes. Yes, we have proposed a fund to help labor strikers in Iran. And as you very well know, the Solidarity movement, a labor movement, which was a labor movement in Poland, was crucial to ending communism in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union. And Iran has been experiencing massive nationwide labor strikes for years now. Even a few months ago, there were massive strikes trying to really pressure the regime to treat laborers better. And as you said, left of center forces in the Western world, progressive forces in the world have really ignored the struggle. They've ignored the labor struggle in Iran. That's one thing they should really care about, their fellow laborers and workers.
One last question, Alireza Jan. As far as this relaxed or naive posture towards the regime in Tehran goes from governments, how do you see the role of media in the free world, and how it is increasingly under attack by activists inside the country, inside Iran, people like Hossein Ronaqi, who under his own name have written a number of tweet threads, and more importantly, a historic op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about how the media of the free world is actually complicit in maintaining repression in Iran. Can you talk a bit about how you see journalists in the free world as having the responsibility to do much better than they are?
Hossein Ronaqi, as you said, is an activist inside Iran, and he wrote a brilliant op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that I recommend everybody read, describing how apologists in the United States and the West in general have been trying to keep information from coming from inside Iran to the outside world, especially, for example, the Aban massacre. Much of the world knows nothing about what happened in Iran. It's really a historic event. And I really do, it's not that I just feel like I've seen it with my own eyes after having worked in Washington, D.C. for so many years. There was a very concentrated or concerted effort by pro-JCPOA forces with the Obama administration working closely with them to shape the narrative on the Iran issue. And people who disagreed with the Obama administration's policies on Iran, on appeasing the Islamic Republic, were often called warmongers. This charge was led by a couple of groups that are suspected of lobbying for the Islamic Republic in Washington, D.C. And they have a network of media supporters and journalists who are particularly close to the former foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Javad Zarif. That network is still quite active. It has been weakened, but it's still trying to push for U.S. reentry into JCPOA and U.S. policies and Canadian policies favorable toward the Islamic Republic. I think one of the ways this regime will be greatly weakened is if it doesn't have an information monopoly in Iran. And I think that has already happened. Social media has done a lot to let us know what's happening in Iran. I remember in 2017, during the uprising of that year, social media played a very crucial role in my understanding of what was happening inside Iran, because people were videotaping events with their cell phones and sending it abroad. But also there are a lot of Persian language broadcasts like Iran International, Manitou TV, that are really informing Iranians about what's happening in the world and in their country. But also I think Iranian activists abroad are doing a pretty good job informing policymakers as well. Once the regime's information monopoly is broken and the JCPOA network's monopoly on information is broken, I think we could see some significant changes in Iran. It's happening bit by bit, but not really fast enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, I used to travel back to Iran until 2005 when I became more active on the human rights democracy front. I went back to Iran 6 times between 1990 and 2005. And even from the first of those trips, or perhaps especially the first of those trips, it was right after the Iran-Iraq war ended, I was consistently met by people wanting to talk about how much they detest the regime. Yes. And this is a very long-term aspiration for democracy on the part of the people of Iran. And it's been a long time that they know that this is a totalitarian regime that is, of course, repressing them and is also very corrupt. But as you described so well, Alireza John, things have evolved in terms of their access to communication and their ability to convey their thoughts and aspirations to the outside world. And as I mentioned, the op-ed by Hossein Ronaqi is the most exemplary display of that, at least in recent times. And thank you so much for being with us, Alireza John, and thank you all for watching this Macdonald-Laurier Institute discussion. It's the first one in our series called Democracy Matters, Conversations on the Future of the Free World. I'm Mariam Memarsadeghi, was really happy to have you with us. Alireza Nader, thank you again for joining us.
And thank you for all the great work you do and your organization does.
Thank you.